in John 3:24, he has this line where he says, oh, by the way, John hadn't been arrested yet. And you think, well, hold on a minute. There's no narration of John's arrest, John the Baptist's arrest, this is. There's no narration of John the Baptist's arrest anywhere in John. So the reader's expected to know what John's arrest is, and not just expected to know, but expected to think that it was strange that John and Jesus were in ministry together at this point. So I can only make sense of things like that if John not only knows the Synoptic Gospels, but also presupposes that his readers know them as well. And the Gospel is explicitly selective in that sense. It'll pull its favorite things out of the Jesus tradition, out of the Synoptics, and use those as its focus. So yes, John is different in that sense from the Synoptics because I think he expects the readers to already know that story.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Mark Goodacre, and I'm lucky enough to have had Erdmans reach out to me and ask me if I wanted to talk about this book, because this is something I probably would have been trying to hunt down months after it came out. So thank you so much to the folks at Erdmans for reaching out about this book, The Fourth Synoptic Gospel, John's Knowledge of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I had a really good time talking to Mark Goodacre. This is one of those, it's a shorter episode than I normally do. Usually they're about an hour, give or take. He is so good at communicating quickly that he even gets out ahead of my meandering brain. And so I get to a point where I'm just like, okay, I think you've exhausted my ability to ask questions within the time frame that we have here. So, I kind of shut things down quicker than I would normally do. I hope to have him back on at some point. His digital content is linked. The book is linked in the show notes. Another link, and it doesn't come up until the end, is a song by a band that it just blew my mind that he brought it up, because it's one of these, it's a band called The Beaches. They are a Canadian, all female band, kind of, I guess, alt rock, maybe. I love them, and he had been to see them, I guess, a couple of weeks before we did this interview in the DC area. And so I linked the song Did I Say Too Much? It's a song off their most recent album. They really are, man, they're such a wonderful band. They are, I feel like when I found them, I feel like I was discovering Jimmy Eat World again, which is another band that I really love. And I will say this, their drummer really gets down. She knows what she's doing. So I will wrap up my comments here, unless you're listening for free, in which case I would encourage you to follow, subscribe, whatever it is that you do on your platform of choice, wherever you're listening. Set it up to automatically download. That means the world to me that when episodes drop for free, I see a larger number of people downloading them right away. Rate, review, leave comments, all that kind of stuff wherever you go. Hit me up on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Spoutable, Blue Sky, Threads, any of the social media platforms. I am out there. Episodes get posted on several of those, as well as over on WordPress and Tumblr. So all of this stuff should be in the links for the show notes. If not here, I know the promotional clips that I post on YouTube have all of those links. So follow me anywhere and everywhere. Or if you want to get me feedback that's just private, maybe you don't think I'm doing a good job, and I would appreciate a private notification of that. So that would be at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. That's all one word. itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. And let me know what you think. Let me know who you want to have on the podcast. I know that there's at least one interview that I have scheduled as of recording this here for December 2025, where someone reached out to me. They said, hey, a friend of mine is a listener to your podcast. He thought this would be a good interview, and now they're on the schedule. I am definitely open to that. The best, the most prized support that I can get from my listeners is support on Patreon. So follow the link in the show notes to patreon.com and become a supporter for $5 a month, and you'll be able to hear episodes early. Okay, that's all for me. Enjoy my conversation with Mark Goodacre. I will be back at the end of the episode to set up next week's. Thanks. Mark Goodacre, welcome to the podcast.
Great pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Let me just make sure. Did I say it correctly? I was asked before.
Yeah, that's okay. I kind of like that. You said it like you might say J.D. Whittaker, but most people would say Goodacre. Like they'll stress the acre bit. Like the origin is it's a good acre, like a good acre of land. So I think it's more like that. But Goodacre is fine. I like it. A lot of Americans pronounce it that way.
Okay. Goodacre. I'm sorry. I usually ask before we start recording,
That's
so
fine.
I'm self-identifying. Okay. I don't want to waste any time, but first, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I was born in the UK. I moved to the US 20 years ago to take up a job at Duke University, where I'm a professor of religious studies, and I specialize in New Testament and Christian origins. I've got a kind of side interest in apocryphal gospels, Jesus in film, but I suppose my main interests over the years have been interrelations of early Christian works like the Gospels in the New Testament, Gospel of Thomas, Proto-Gospel of James, that kind of thing.
Okay. And a podcast.
Yeah, I've had a podcast since 2009. It has to be said that it's kind of ebbed and flowed. In the early years, there were lots of episodes, and then I got caught up in university administration and was unable to do much with it for quite a long time. But I've completely resurrected it recently, and it has pictures now too. So I've gone the YouTube route too. So I still do the audio version, but I do a video version as well.
Cool. Okay. All right. So your book, and it was a learning experience just starting the book for me.
Okay.
That I did not realize that I have been operating for decades now with a misunderstanding of what the term synoptic means. And so that may be a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, well, so the title of the book, I have it here, is The Fourth Synoptic Gospel. Not actually my title. Oh, there it is. Yeah, thank you. It's not actually my title. My publisher came up with the idea to call it that, and I kind of liked it because it's provocative. Because the reason why it's provocative is of course, because we all know, we've all been taught, I've taught this myself, that there are three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that John is different. And the reason we call the synoptics is because John is so different. So obviously this is a highly provocative title. But the reality in it is that I just kept staring at my synopsis of the Gospels on my desk. And for those viewers that don't know what a synopsis of the Gospels is, it's basically a book in which you put the three synoptics side by side in columns, so you can compare them easily, and it helps you diagnose which one is the first, which one is copying off whom, are there any hypothetical texts, and so on. Do you know what it's actually called, the synopsis that was sitting on my desk? It's called Synopsis of the Four Gospels. That's the actual title of it, of the most popular. That's not just some weird synopsis, that's the mainstream synopsis that all scholars and students use. And I thought, well, John is synoptic frequently. Yes, he's less close to Matthew, Mark, and Luke than they are to each other. But John is frequently side by side with the synoptics in a gospel synopsis. So technically, to me, there's no question that John is synoptic.
And so I just want to call it the term of it being side by side. So I know that I think what I thought in my head is, if you go to IMDb or you flip the book over, you're reading the synopsis. Mm-hmm. And that is a different application of a similar term.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry. Yes, that is even. So one of the things about New Testament criticism is it's full of annoying technical terms, some of which are used in ways completely counterintuitive. We have in New Testament criticism as well something called redaction criticism. And in normal English, redaction means blanking out bits of text for, confidential purposes or whatever. Synopsis is like that. So it doesn't mean like when we're talking about a synopsis of the Gospels, we're not talking about a summary or an abstract or something like that. We're talking about it in a really overly literal way of the sin bit is together with, and the opsis bit is the I. So it's looking at the three together. So yes, I find this all the time. I should have begun there. I find this all the time when I'm teaching that people will go, well, why synopsis? Well, you're writing summaries of stuff. So yeah, very misleading. Very misleading.
I think it's unfortunate, but I don't. I mean,
Yeah,
I wouldn't say misleading because that seems like it's calculated. But I do
yeah,
think that there's a similarity or a symmetry maybe between like ground level in the pews kind of theology where you'll hear. And so I brought this up at the podcast before, and my wife was saying, I was always told read John first, and I feel
yeah,
like this book. If
yeah.
people read this book, they will get the sense that like, oh no, Matthew, Mark, and Luke not even mentioning the Hebrew Bible, which should come
Right.
before any of that to make
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, yeah.
But Matthew, Mark, and Luke for John to make sense, I feel like you're saying often a lot of the silence in John should leave the reader to infer a familiarity with the other Gospels, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I was going to call this book Fourth Gospel, meaning that it's best to be read fourth in the order it's in all of our New Testaments, because I think the author of the Fourth Gospel is deliberately choosing not to narrate certain things that he knows about, which are told in the synoptics. So, I mean, one example is in John 3:24, he has this line where he says, oh, by the way, John hadn't been arrested yet. And you think, well, hold on a minute. There's no narration of John's arrest, John the Baptist arrest, this is. There's no narration of John the Baptist arrest anywhere in John. So the reader's expected to know what John's arrest is, and not just expected to know, but expected to think that it was strange that John and Jesus were in ministry together at this point. So I can only make sense of things like that if John not only knows the synoptic gospels, but also presupposes that his readers know them as well. And the gospel is explicitly selective in that sense. It'll pull its favorite things out of the Jesus tradition, out of the synoptics, and use those as its focus. So so yes, John is different in that sense from the synoptics because I think he expects the readers to already know that story.
So there's a thing that comes up a lot in the book is the importance of text, of literary production
Hmm.
as opposed to oral tradition. Do you mind talking about that juxtaposition there and why that's so important?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about oral tradition is that it's one of these things. So the problem with oral tradition is essentially that it's lost by definition. If people are just, in an era with no, I was going to say tape recorders. That sounds really old fashioned, but in an era with no recording devices, tape recorders, gosh, that's what we used when I was a kid. In an era with no recording devices, every every bit of speech is lost, except insofar as it's crystallized in texts. And one of the things that I think happens with oral tradition, or at least the appeal to oral tradition within scholarship, is scholars use oral tradition to fill in the gaps. Anytime that they're uncertain about what's going on, they'll go, oh, John must have got this from the oral tradition. To the extent that oral tradition has become this kind of default, it's this category that can explain absolutely everything. And of course, it can explain everything because it's by its definition lost. So my problem, I suppose, with oral tradition is it's not what it affirms, which is that people talk to one another, obviously. It's what it denies, which is that frequently you can see a literary contact between John and the other gospels. So I feel that oral tradition has been stretched and stretched and stretched to the point where it's just broken. And what we really need to do is focus instead on these literary links between the synoptics and John.
I know I went through this phase about 20 years ago where I came across people like Kenneth Bailey, and
Hmm.
his work was very cemented in his experience, in the Levant with people who still circulate information orally, and I think there's validity to that point of view. And then you're kind of reverse engineering an understanding
Hmm.
of oral tradition, but what you're saying is we have texts available. We have we have
Hmm.
manuscripts available that we can look at and make assertions about rather
Yeah.
than taking all these steps backward that are always only ever going to be hypothetical, right?
Hmm. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the Kenneth Bailey's work is absolutely fascinating because there's almost a kind of romance to it. The idea that the Gospels come from kind of like village communities where the people are just sitting around the campfire and telling stories to one another, and it instantly appeals to us as a way of imagining the ancient world, especially if you make it kind of exotic by saying, oh, I'm not going to just talk to contemporary Westerners. I'm going to go and research this fully with different cultures from ours. But there are some real problems with it. And in fact, there's a very good article by Theodore Whedon that actually refutes a lot of what Kenneth Bailey was arguing. He that you can actually test it because some of Kenneth Bailey's examples actually are paralleled. I don't know whether he knew this or not, but they're actually paralleled in some literature and show some of Kenneth Bailey's work to be quite problematic. So I'm not a big fan of that model. I mean, early Christian communities, in any case, weren't like these little. I mean, this is what it means when we say early Christian communities. It's people that were hanging out together, worshiping together, reading scriptures together, reciting things together. It's not people sitting around the campfire telling folk tales. So, I mean, I found his work really attractive when I first read it, but I don't think it stands up to scrutiny as well as looking at actual parallel texts that have verbatim agreements between them. Because when you get the verbatim agreements and the parallels in literary structure, you've got to start saying it's more likely literary links than oral storytelling.
Yeah, and I guess there's a kind of a romanticization of like Orientalism, and this may be like
Absolutely.
the best iteration. Yeah, not to
Yeah.
pick on the man; he's not here to defend
No,
himself.
I
And
know, I do, and it does make me feel bad. And maybe after I've gone, there'll be someone talking about how we've now managed to refute all Mark Goodacre's work, and the guy didn't know what he was talking about.
well, if this is still out there, shut up, you. Uh, yeah, I mean, I'll probably be gone too, so it's not like it'll matter to me. I do wonder, and I think I put something in the questions that I sent you about this. So, because I follow like Bible nerd social media,
Hmm.
I'll see these little things pop up about Markan or Matthean priority. Does that matter for your thesis here? Like where the other gospels prior to John, what their chronology is in
Hmm.
production.
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is yes. It really does matter, and I think the cornerstone for me, the foundation of any discussion of gospel relationships, is that Mark is the first gospel, and that Mark was used by Matthew and Luke. And the reason why, and that I'm with the vast majority of scholars on that. There are very, very few people these days who defend anything other than Mark and priority. Doesn't mean it's right because of that, but I'm just saying that that's a fact. That's not something that, and I have argued for it in previous publications. So I'm not just jumping on a bandwagon or believing what everyone else believes. I've actually argued for that conclusion myself, tried to think of fresh arguments for Mark and priority. But the reason why it's relevant in the context of this book is that I think that frequently you can see Matthew editing Mark, Luke editing Mark, and John taking over those bits where Matthew and Luke have edited Mark. I mean, scholars talk about these as their redactional fingerprints. So Matthew has a certain way that he'll rephrase Mark. And then when you find that very rephrasing turning up in John's gospel, it has to be striking. And that's one of the reasons why the oral tradition model doesn't work so well, because sometimes it's just a case of Matthew's rearranged the way that Mark's expressed something. Like in the story of the crown of thorns, Matthew just basically restructures the whole sentence, doesn't add anything of substance at all, just restructures the way that it's written. And then in John's version of the crown of thorns, it's much, much closer to Matthew than it is to Mark. So John is taking over the ways that Matthew has rewritten Mark. And the same thing happens in the way that Luke rewrites Mark. So for me, it is definitely the building block. You could still argue that John knew the synoptics. If you thought Matthew was the first gospel, you would simply have to say that Mark has rewritten Matthew at certain points, and then John takes over those Markan rewrites. But I don't think that's what actually happened. So you could still have the argument if you're a Matthean priorist, but I think the sounder argument is the one that is based on Mark and priority. I mean, the other wrinkle in it is I also think that Luke knew Matthew. Not all scholars believe that. Lots of people think Luke was independent of Matthew and that they both used a document called Q. And so that actually will affect some readers' appreciation of the book. If they're big believers in Q, they might go, well, Goodacre's being a bit cheeky there, assuming his own hypothesis that Luke knew Matthew as well. But what I say is I've argued for that position in a book and 5 further articles. So I think I'm allowed at least to build on what I've done in the past.
But again, with Q, and for listeners, if you're not familiar, Q is a shortened. I believe the word is Quelle, right? It's a German
Yeah,
word
German
for
word means
source.
source. Yeah.
And it is also hypothetical. It's
Right.
not a document that we have on hand,
No.
and it is again hypothesized to be sayings, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because it basically, Q is pulled out of the common material that you find in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. So that material has to have come from somewhere. And really, your options are either Luke copied out of Matthew, Matthew copied out of Luke, or they're both copied out of something else which is lost. And the majority view for some time has been that Luke and Matthew are both copying from the something else, and that something else they label Q, as you say, first letter of Quelle, which means source. And that material that is common to Matthew and Luke, it's largely, but not entirely, sayings material. So that's why Q soon looks like more of a saying source than a narrative source. So, but there are narratives in there as well to complicate things. But yes, I don't think it existed. I think it's essentially a scholarly fiction which has been created because people haven't, in my opinion, been able to see the evidence that Luke knew Matthew and not this hypothetical source.
And so these differences or redactional fingerprints or whatever, it seems like when you look at the finished product of any of of any of these 4 gospels, what's happening is that there's, I don't know, is it a different point of view? Is it geographically based? Is it theologically based? Is it like how would you propose that we understand what drove the different evangelists to generate these different products in the macro? And I will
Right.
say
Yeah.
before I let you answer that
Mhm.
you deal in micro a lot with like the text within the gospel. So I do want to encourage readers, buy the book and read the examples that he gives, but kind of in the macro, how do you think that is driven?
I mean, my answer, I suppose, is all of the above. So, I mean, even down to geographical things, yes, they all 4 gospels add fresh geographical details at some point, fresh political details. Matthew's the only gospel to mention Herod Archelaus. Luke is the only person to mention someone called Lysanias. Then you get to John's gospel, and John adds all sorts of fresh characters like Nicodemus and Nathaniel. So every gospel adds place names, character names that aren't found in the others. But I think you mentioned theological differences as well. I don't think that you sit down to write a fresh gospel unless you think that your source material needs, at the very least, a bit of tweaking, and if not, outright rewriting. So all of their theologies have, yes, big points of contact, but also very important points of divergence. And the other thing which is frequently overlooked is that each evangelist is their own gifted literary author. They all have different kinds of genius. Matthew really is the poet of the New Testament. And when he restructures and rephrases things from Mark, they're much more memorable. He's just got a really memorable, rhythmic kind of poetic style. Luke, I would say, is the great storyteller of the New Testament. He's just better at crafting stories than Matthew or Mark are. And that's why we always remember the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, because they're examples of Lucan creative reworking or composition from scratch. So and then you get to John, and John also has a very distinctive literary style. He actually, amazingly enough, although lots of people think of John's Gospel as being really profound, and it's the one that, it rewards the most kind of reflection and meditation. When you read it in Greek, it's surprising because it's way easier to read than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The vocabulary is smaller. And John keeps repeating certain themes: light, life, witness. These themes just keep coming through again and again and again. So John has that, but also I would say, like Luke, he's a very gifted storyteller. His characters really come alive off the page. The blind man in chapter 9 and his parents, the Samaritan woman in chapter 4, the character of Nicodemus, a new character in chapter 3. All of these characters just ping off the page, to say nothing of Mary and Martha and Lazarus in John 11 and 12. So John is a gifted dramatic writer, I think, and someone who really kind of can craft plausible characters.
So I did want to note, I take this as correction because I wasn't thinking in the way that you were thinking. When I said geography, I meant more like where were they produced. But it
Okay.
is no, I mean, and that is a valid thing. Like, I probably should have clarified
Well, and
that,
that's
because the
well, and that's
internal geography matters too.
yeah, well, that's relevant as well, because there are certain terms that you'll see in the Gospels which are completely Palestinian or non-Israeli. So, for example, when they talk about amounts of money, the all four Gospels tend to use terms amounts of money that are more familiar outside of Israel. I mean, the obvious one is they often use the term denarius, which is like in Matthew 20 is a day's wages, and then in the feeding of the 5,000, in both Mark and John, they say 200 denarii would not buy enough food for all these people. And and this denarius, it comes to all four Gospels. And you know what? There's hardly any denarii been found in Israel, in Galilee, Judea, Samaria. It's just not currency that was used there. So that means that the evangelists are reflecting their geographical location. We don't know where it is, but for all four of them, it's, I would say, almost certainly outside of Galilee, Judea, etc. It's somewhere out there, like Rome or Corinth, or somewhere where that kind of currency is current. And Mark has loads of Latinisms. John frequently feels he needs to explain Jewish law as well. Like he assumes his readers don't even know what the Passover is, which is amazing. I mean, he says in chapter 6, he says it was near the time of Passover, which is a festival of the Jews. And it's like, well, that's Judaism 101, isn't it? Passover. But he thinks that some of his readers won't know that. So yeah, that also suggests that John and the others writing outside of Galilee, Judea.
This is a silly, I guess, dot to connect, but I've been reading Jingo by Terry Pratchett,
Mm-hmm.
and several times he mentions someone having to pay $2 for something,
Right.
and I'm bringing that up because, like, well, Terry Pratchett, for listeners who are new and haven't heard me talk about him before, like, he lives in the UK. Why would he
Yeah.
be speaking in terms of dollars? So
Mm-hmm.
I think they did that for Jared, so
Yeah.
that it was a type of currency that I would understand.
That's right. Yeah.
So, so chronology of when they were produced, we've covered that. Like, in what order, I guess, but
Mm-hmm.
the temporal chronology, where did, and if you want to punt, because this is not what the book is about, but where do they appear in history, would you say?
Yeah, it's a good question. I love thinking about this. And I think one of the reasons I like thinking about it so much is because there's actually quite a large span of time during which these four gospels could have been produced. So it seems to me that they all have to be after 70 CE, because they're all obsessed in differing ways with the destruction of the temple. So Jesus, prophesies the destruction of the temple. He enacts something in the temple in all four, where he goes in and drives out traders. And even on the cross in the Synoptics, they're saying to him, "You who would destroy the temple." So I think that they all have to be post 70. It makes best sense of that data. But equally, they can't be too late, because manuscripts and, well, little papyrus fragments of them start turning up, possibly as early as the middle second century, depends when you want to date them. But also people start referring to them in the early to middle second century. And by the 170s, when Irenaeus is writing, Irenaeus talks about these four canonical gospels as being like the four corners of the world, the 4 points of the compass. So already by the 170s, they're pretty well established, at least in Irenaeus's circles. So that gives you like a 100-year period during which they have to have been written. I would actually then narrow that down a bit further by saying that there's an earlier writer called Ignatius who seems to know Matthew and Luke at least. And because I think Matthew knew Mark, Luke knew Matthew and Mark, and John knew all three, that gives me a sequence. So out of all of those, sort of, these are like little, you talked about connecting the dots, but these are like little dots. Out of all those, here's the way I would connect them. And this is a hypothesis. This, I can't prove this. This is basically speculation based on the evidence we have. I would say, roughly speaking, Mark's probably written in the 70s, Matthew in the 80s or 90s, Luke in the early 2nd century, and John after Luke. So John, I'm going to put also in the early 2nd century. That actually then, that those dates would line up with all of our external evidence. Though some people would want to push them a bit earlier than me, some would want to push them a bit later than me.
And this again, you can say pass if you, but as far as how they're okay, so when they're written, that is a single document, but they begin to be copied and circulated, and that takes time. So that, I mean, this is kind of underlying the answer you just gave.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like immediately if you or I make a blog post, that is available to anyone who wants it, and that is not the process here. So what do you imagine that process of the I guess spread and dissemination?
Sure, and it's one of the most fun things to reflect on. I mean, scholars always used to allow 10 years for things to disseminate across the world. So, give Mark 10 years to get to Matthew's and Luke's communities. You don't actually need that. I mean, all right, yes, travel took a bit longer in the ancient world, but you have networks that are connected and related, and you've got trade routes. You don't have to have someone let's say Luke's gospel is written in Corinth. It doesn't take someone to, and let's say Matthew is written in, just the sake of argument, Antioch in Syria. You don't have to have someone take Matthew's gospel all the way from Antioch all the way to Corinth. You just have to have somebody close to Antioch, and then close to Antioch, and then and you just have, and you get this spread because the word gets out. And the thing is, it's no coincidence that the 4 gospels that we have in the New Testament all have a certain literary quality, and you can see why they were popular. And I think when you have a work that has a kind of attractiveness, like these 4 canonical gospels have, word gets around. People go, "Oh, have you seen this new gospel? It's fantastic!" I mean, it's like, I'm thinking now about Matthew. It's like Mark's gospel, but there's this whole bunch more teaching in it. It's got this Sermon on the Mount, which Jesus, talks about, how you should live your life in the interim before the eschaton. I mean, so as soon as people are talking about it, you then have the literary elites going, "Oh, I want to get a copy of this. It sounds great." So they send their enslaved person, their scribe, and they go and make a copy and bring it back. And, so you do get these networks. And I don't think these networks take, 10 years, for one gospel to get to another place. They can take a short amount of time. I do think, however, that Matthew, Luke, and John all seem to know Mark really, really well, and that might mean that they've been working with Mark for quite some time. They're getting really familiar with the way that Mark is written. The way that John, for example, just laces his narrative with little nuggets that come from Mark's gospel that aren't found in Matthew and Luke. I mean, I mentioned 200 denarii already. Just these little memorable pieces that come out of Mark, or when he's doing the story of the anointing in John, it's an anointing by Mary in Bethany. She opens this really costly pistic nard, and this term pistic nard, very uncommon in the ancient world. The first occurrence I could find of it in Greek literature is here in Mark and here in John. And then Judas says in John, 300 denarii would not buy enough. This could have been sold for 300 denarii and the money, given to the poor. And it's just one of these lovely little memorable details from Mark, a kind of literary flourish that John has just interlaced in with his narrative. And I think this happens quite a bit. That suggests to me John really knows Mark. I think it's the same with Matthew and Luke. He knows their gospel so well that he can actually just interlace some of these kind of little details. And it kind of reassures the reader of the Synoptics that they're on familiar territory, because John is different. But then while you're thinking, oh gosh, this is a bit different, you're then suddenly back on familiar territory again. It's like a reassuring the reader we're still moving in that familiar world of the synoptics.
I think, let me run this by you. I'm drawing an inference from something that you were saying about the circulation of texts. And it is, had the reliance been solely on oral tradition, it would have frozen that spread,
Hmm.
because if you're relying on non-literate people to
Hmm.
circulate these mass, from memory, these are long stories, as opposed to a text. You don't get that. Okay, it shows up here and it gets copied, and then it shows up over there and it gets copied. It like the time that it would take to learn the narrative in a reliable fashion paralyzes it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kinda. I mean, I think there's basically a. I mean, if I can be bold, I think there's an error here in some scholarship where they make the valid point that most people in antiquity were illiterate, and then they extrapolate from that to an invalid point that therefore the Gospels are likely products of circulating oral tradition. Because the thing is, if you live in a society where you've only got a handful of literate people, the literate people have real power. It's not like in our society where, most Americans are literate. If you're in a society where only a handful of people are literate, what happens is the literate elite talk to one another and use one another's works. And when you look at the New Testament, I actually did this for my book on the Gospel of Thomas, which I produced a few years ago. I went through and listed every tradent, like somebody who is passing on tradition. I listed every tradent that's mentioned in the New Testament, and virtually all of them appear to be literate. In other words, the people sharing the traditions are actually literate themselves. The two exceptions, interestingly, are Peter and John, who in Acts of the Apostles are said to be agrammatoi in Greek, unlettered. And the narrative specifically draws attention to them as being like kind of the originating, people in that tradition. So it's not that there weren't illiterate people sharing the traditions, it's that the literary elite become the really key figures. So I don't think I believe in this model where you have just like oceans of oral tradition flowing around from one illiterate person to another. There must have been some of that. People were talking to one another, and there were important illiterate people like Peter and John that were doing that kind of work. But I think the really important people are the literary elites who are moving in circles where they become aware of some new literary work that's arrived. So I think we've made the wrong inference from mass illiteracy in antiquity. The inference we need to make is that makes the literate elites more important than they are today.
Is there anything? Is there an analogous body of work other than the Gospels, but like that functions like the Gospels, where it's the same story being told and they get collected together?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a very good example of it in the Hebrew Bible, which may have provided an inspiration for someone like Matthew, and that's when you get to in the Old Testament. It's kind of fun. You go 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and the story from 1 Samuel all the way through to the end of 2 Kings really takes you on a journey through the period prior to the setup of the monarchy, all the way through all of the kings to the point where finally Judea goes into exile and the monarchy is ended. And then you turn over the page from 2 Kings expecting to see the next bit of the story. And instead, we go to 1 Chronicles 1, and we've gone right back to the beginning of the story again. And 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles is essentially a rewrite of 1 and 2 Kings, a little bit of Samuel in there as well. And it's if you had never read the Old Testament, you'd find it pretty jarring. Like, why are we telling this story again? If you go a bit further back, look at the Pentateuch. The Ten Commandments come twice, once in Exodus 20 and once in Deuteronomy 5. And so before you get to the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy 5, you've read all the way through the rest of Exodus, all the way through Leviticus, all the way through Numbers, and then you get this story resuming. So the idea of retelling the same story in different words is already there, bedded into the Hebrew scriptures. Or then go to the Jewish historian Josephus, who is a contemporary with the gospel writers, and he tells the story all again. And what he does actually, he pulls stuff in and conflates the different bits of the tradition and so on. But yeah, absolutely. So this is something we've already got in the materials that we know that the gospel writers used.
I think that's an interesting example of how not only engagement with, but also the production of biblical texts is a negotiation.
Yeah.
And that's a thing that's come up here. Or, I really,
Hmm.
I think the best example of how I learned that lesson really quickly was Yi-Jan Lin's uh, um, JBL article where she, the rewriting of Hebrews 11 and 12.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't want to eat up too much of your time. I know you have a hard out, so I'll start kind of moving things in a closeout
Sure.
direction. What from the book were you hoping I would ask about that has not come up?
Well, do you know what? I've been surprised in conversations I've had with people about the book that people haven't talked much with me. Maybe it's because it's the last chapter about John's Christology. So and let me explain why I think that's been something that I hope people will look at. One of the ways that you can characterize people like me who love doing textual comparison is we can, to be frank, to be self-deprecating, we can really look like the nerds, the geeks of the field. People that are like probably the kind of people that love computer code and crossword puzzles and word games and things like that. And obviously, there's some truth in that. We are nerds, but one of the things that I say in answer to that, or I'm trying to address in answer to that, is if you get your relationship between literary works right, you can actually tell the story of how Christology developed. And that is really important. So let me illustrate. In my last chapter on John's Christology, I call it John's Christological transformation of the Synoptics. I argue that the main thing that John is doing is he's trying to take stuff that's implicit in the Synoptics and make it explicit in John. So I'll give you an example. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus says at the Last Supper, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. Clearly, there, Jesus is the shepherd, the disciples are the sheep. Well, lo and behold, in John 10, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. Much more direct. Or you have Jesus saying at the Last Supper in the Synoptics that he will not eat again from the fruit of the vine until he eats it new in the kingdom of God. And then lo and behold, same setting in John's Gospel. He says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. And what I started noticing when I was writing this is that every single I am saying in John uses imagery that's already familiar from the Synoptics. And in fact, it uses imagery that's used repeatedly in the synoptics on certain times, like the idea of Jesus as the bread of life in John 6 really comes out of lots of discussions of bread in the synoptics and so on. So I kind of like that way of trying to tell the story, because to me it's an interesting story when you can see the conversations already going on within the canon. And you can, I mean, my friend James Barker talks about this is like a kind of a snowballing effect where you can see places where we go from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John as the snowball gathers snow and gathers momentum. And of course, you don't always have a clear trajectory from A to B to C to D, because sometimes someone wants to pull back on something, but even there you can see that work as well. So I suppose that's and it took me the longest to write the last chapter as well. So that's why I'm most pleased with that. And I finished it last. You don't always finish your last chapter last, but in this case I did it because I was struggling. I was struggling with it. And so the fact that somehow I managed to get it together makes me feel more proud of that than of probably the other bits of the book. But, you know, it's out there for other people to look at now, and I can't do anything about it.
Truth be told, I was afraid of how many rabbit trails I would follow if I brought up
Yeah.
the Christology part.
Yeah. Because it is so massive. It's so massive. Yeah, exactly.
So what would you recommend listeners read, watch, listen to get a better understanding of the Gospels broadly, or John specifically, or anything else in addition to this book. Obviously,
Oh,
they
that's
need to go
very,
buy this book.
very kind of you to say. And also, if I would love it if anybody went along and looked at my YouTube channel where I release lots of stuff on the Gospels over on there, especially like video shorts and other things. But I think I just mentioned James Barker's new book, Writing and Rewriting the Gospels. I would recommend that because it's a similar length to my book, same publisher, a very different book in terms of what it covers, but provides a really great introduction to what it means to look at the four canonical gospels together. And one of the things that Barker is very good at doing is the kind of practical stuff, the material reality of what it means to compose a gospel. So I would strongly recommend James Barker's book. On John's Gospel, there's a book just out by Hugo Mendes from UNC Chapel Hill called The Gospel of John, A New History. Fantastic book. Strongly recommend that as well. Gosh, there's all sorts of things. I would say if you're wanting to do, if you haven't got much of a background in New Testament, I think the historical introduction to the New Testament by Bart Ehrman and Hugo Mendes, the 8th edition, that is. Bart had written the previous 7 editions, and I've used those in my classes for years. But now the 8th edition is expanded. You've got another voice in there, Hugo Mendes, and I think that's a fantastic place to start as well. So, a few of those recommendations, hopefully they're good. And of course, as you know, Jared, there's tons of stuff available now on YouTube. I mean, I've been on the Biblical Time Machine, Helen Bond's podcast, a couple of times. That's not a YouTube, that's an audio one. But I mean, I mean, Bart Ehrman's channel, tons of good stuff on the Gospels on it. I mean, I'm sure a lot of your viewers know some of this stuff, but and if the algorithm's working when they've watched this, it'll recommend some of these things to them.
I know I got tricked by Ian over at the New Testament Review podcast.
Yeah.
Well, so normally the title is clearer as to what you're going to listen to, and I try to avoid listening to people I know I'm going to interview before I interview them.
Yeah, oh,
but I think
actually,
I was into my run when I realized, oh wait, oh no, oh, I hope this doesn't incept me at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, New Testament Review, that's also another good example.
It's fabulous, yeah. And I feel very proud of that because Ian Mills and Laura Robinson were doctoral students at Duke. So there's a particular joy hearing them being so good at articulating, ideas of great New Testament scholars and then critiquing them. I think they're great.
There was a period there early on in the podcast with like Curtis Freeman, and I know he's not there anymore, Stanley Hauerwas, where I was just getting all these Duke names on the podcast, and I was like, is this the Duke University podcast that I'm fine with that, but John DePew, I know he was out there. My last question is, what do you read for fun?
I'm afraid I'm a bit like one of these I think a lot of middle-aged or older men kind of stop reading for fun because especially in academia, because you're reading so much for academia. So it's only really when I go on vacation that I end up reading stuff. Let me think. I think the last thing that I enjoyed reading was a bunch of short stories by Somerset Maugham, and I just they are fabulous if you're on a vacation where you're getting up and down all the time, because you can squeeze in one more short story. They're compelling, and they've been used for adaptations of fiction and film. So I've enjoyed that. And I suppose I do more TV actually than I do reading. I enjoy a lot of TV. Both new stuff and old, and I enjoy my science fiction. I love Doctor Who. I like the Star Trek franchise. Pretty much watched everything from the Star Trek world.
Hold on,
certainly watched everything.
What's your favorite? What's your favorite Star Trek series?
Well, I think I have to say the original series and be boring, but I would say I've really enjoyed Strange New Worlds, which is like the most recent, and I think that has actually evoked something of the original series. So I would say in order of preference, the original series, then Strange New Worlds, then probably The Next Generation, then maybe Deep Space Nine, in that kind of order.
I'm going to tell you, I don't care for that maybe, and I don't care for that placement of Deep Space Nine. I know it was an opinion-based question. The problem with Deep Space Nine is that it came out at the same time as Babylon 5.
which I absolutely loved. And so I think for me, it suffered a bit by comparison. I should go back and revisit. I should go back and revisit.
See, I think for me it's the opposite. The problem with
Oh,
Babylon
really?
5 is that it came out at the same time as Deep Space
Oh,
Nine, and I knew the
interesting.
one before the other.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So
Yeah.
it's
Isn't that
kind of
interesting? Yeah, how that
so
affects our enjoyment.
I kind of have to like slink away when conversations around Monty Python come up,
Yeah,
because so many people who were influenced by Monty Python were on my radar first.
right.
And then when I got to Monty Python, I was like, well, I mean, I feel like I saw somebody who
Mhm,
just took this ball and ran with it.
mhm.
So it's hard for me to yeah, so what you see first really does matter.
Yeah.
Well, here, I'll throw another one out there then. What do you do to decompress?
Uh, I suppose music is one of the big things. I like a lot of contemporary music. I just went to see Wolf Alice up in DC a couple of weeks ago. I went to see a band called The Beaches last Sunday.
Oh,
We're
I love
from
the beaches. I
They are
love them so
fabulous.
much.
Oh, great. So, do you know, I've got to the Ritz Raleigh and I got there early and went right to the front. And I'm afraid I completely geeked out. They are fabulous. I'm so pleased. A lot of people I mention it and they glaze over. So I'm delighted you like the
No,
beaches. They're fantastic.
I get up really early, and I get into work early, and I go for a run.
Hmm.
And the day that their album dropped, I saw, like, my phone notified me. I pre-ordered it, and I got to
Hmm.
go on a run. And it's not the pace you'd think you'd want to run to, but it was.
Yeah.
It's yeah, I really like their new album.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
And live they played 6 or 7 tracks from the new album. I mean, they really lent into it, but yeah, it's great stuff.
I may link a beaches song. Is there a song that you like that I maybe could link to, like, the YouTube video?
Yeah, have I said too much off the new album? Did
Okay.
I say too much off the new
Okay.
album?
Yeah. No, that's a good
Cracker.
one.
Absolute
Okay.
cracker.
Well, Mark Goodacre, thank you so much for sitting down with me. It was a treat.
Total pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your support. Yeah, I had fun with this episode. Again, click through that link to any of Mark Goodacre's content, his YouTube channel, follow his podcast. He's a good guy who's out there doing good work, as well as any of the other recommendations that he or I made as far as digital content creators. John DePue's YouTube channel is linked. The New Testament review is linked. Yeah, follow up on any of those. They are great places to learn more within the realm of biblical studies. And don't forget the beaches. Check them out. They're a really good band. Next week on the podcast, uh, this is my first foray into a commentary, and it was with the team of Peter Altman and Caio Perez, and it's the Book of Numbers. The episode title will not be Numbers. It'll be something different, but that's what we're talking about, is their commentary from the Tyndale Old Testament commentary series on the Book of Numbers. If you want to hear this episode now, you can go over to Patreon and become a supporter for $5 a month, and the episode is already available. Otherwise, yeah, I guess keep on trucking, and if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Here's a preview of next week's episode with Peter Altman and Caio Perez.
These laws are supposed to do is form the way we think about the world. That they're not the concrete things that we draw on. And maybe just to take an example that supports this is that there's very few citations of biblical law texts, so the prescriptions and those types of things, throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible. It's just not used that way. And also even into Persian and Hellenistic periods. So thinking about the times before and after Alexander the Great conquers what we now call the Middle East, that's just not the way that communities of faith are using these texts. And so instead, and what that opens up, I think for us, it's really helpful, is that it means that we don't necessarily have to expect there to be this static and unchanging kind of law code a word that I've avoided so far in the conversation for what we see when we read these texts. We don't need to kind of put it all together somehow to form the constitution that we then somehow live our lives based on. But we can see instead how God in the tradition is showing people of faith how they can dream and imagine, and of course that's going to affect the way they live and decisions that are made. But it's much more about forming us as people. And so thinking about biblical literature and Numbers here as part of that as formational, rather than as perhaps only getting caught in maybe a Pauline, so thinking here about Romans or Galatians or Hebrews, that the law was the old, and we somehow replace that with love or with grace or with faith or something like that. Instead, biblical law, I would say, is an example of life of faith in a particular time and place, and actually in more than one, in times and places. And one of the ways that we see this just within the narrative of the Pentateuch itself, so to step just outside of Numbers, but to see the way that we have the Ten Commandments show up in Deuteronomy when they were already given in Exodus, that they're given for another time and place. And there's another way of thinking about how these laws function a little bit differently. And that's the same type of thing that we see going on in Numbers. And I think if we approach reading the book of Numbers with that perspective, which we call reading in concert, rather than just reading sequentially in the introduction, that can be such an invitation towards a deep kind of reading of these legal texts that forms us as individuals and people of faith.